Hello and welcome to today's webcast brought to you by Cabling Installation and Maintenance. Today's event is entitled Non-Compliant Cable, Understanding the Risks and Avoiding Liability, and will be presented by Todd Harple, Director of Marketing and Product Management with BerkTech, who will present on behalf of the Communications Cable and Connectivity Association. Also Natalia Medley, a counsel with the law firm Crowell & Mooring, and Steve Gallen, Business Development Director with Underwriters Laboratories. The event is being sponsored by the CCCA, Crowell & Mooring, and UL. My thanks go to these organizations for sponsoring today's webcast and for presenting the information that you'll see and hear today. Today's presentations will provide three perspectives on the issue of non-compliant cable being sold, bought, and installed into networks today. At this point, I will pull up the first slide of our next presentation. It will be delivered by Natalia Medley, counsel with Crowell & Mooring, LLP. She'll talk about liability, as you can see on her opening slide. So, Natalia, whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. This is Natalia Medley. I am an attorney with Crowell & Mooring, LLP. We are a law firm. We are headquartered in Washington, D.C., which is where I work. And I'm going to talk to you all today about potential liabilities for installers of non-compliant cable, as was just described. Now, just as a point of information before we get started here, again, the focus on this is installers, not necessarily manufacturers or importers of that non-compliant cable, but rather those individuals or companies who actually install non-compliant cable into structures. And before we get started, too, just my legal disclaimer, I want to let you all know that this presentation today provides an overview of potential liability, but is not and should not be construed as legal advice. Want to note that potential liability for any individual may differ depending on specific facts and circumstances and jurisdictions, which I'll walk through some of those today. But just to remind you that if you have any questions about liability or the liability of any particular installer, that an installer should consult its own legal counsel for advice. So with that out of the way, we'll get started here. So first, an overview of exactly what we're talking about. As we were just going through, we're talking about installers of CMR or CMP cable, so plenum or riser cable. And we're looking at the cable that violates the National Electrical Code, the NEC, as published by the NFPA. And there are specific standards there for cable that fails the fire safety tests and requirements. The liability that we will be examining today is focused on violations of building codes around the country and results from those violations, in addition to any civil liability or liability in lawsuits for any harm that may result from these types of installations of non-compliant cable. So starting first with the issue of building code violation, as I think many of you know, the National Electrical Code, the NEC, has been incorporated in building codes in many different jurisdictions. Now, the NEC itself does not have the force of law, so as developed, as many of you may have read the NEC, it's not legally enforceable necessarily, but it has, as noted here, been incorporated into many building codes. And those building codes are adopted by states or also some local jurisdictions, like counties or towns, and they will have the opportunity, each locality, each jurisdiction, to examine the NEC, examine other standards that are in effect, and pick and choose to adopt them, to add terms when they adopt, or to just adopt wholesale the terms. And I've seen in doing research for this and in consulting with others, the NEC has been adopted wholesale by many jurisdictions. So the fire safety provisions that are and the standards that are in effect in the NEC are relevant to installers in many jurisdictions in the United States. That being said, however, because the NEC may be adopted differently from place to place, it's something that is important to understand. So wherever an installation is being done, the laws and local ordinances of that particular jurisdiction should be understood and should be studied so that we understand, or that one understands, the applicable laws. So when we're talking about building code violations, it'll be set up, like I said, in a state or local statute or ordinance. And you think about, okay, well, if these standards are in effect, what happens if a standard is breached? And that here I'm referring to as penalties, because the enforcement mechanism for building code violations is that the government would enforce it in most cases. Something to note in general, knowledge of noncompliance is not required. In other words, as an installer, if an installer purchases cable and goes to install it and doesn't necessarily know about whether or not it actually complies with the NEC standards, that is not a defense in most cases to liability, to penalties for these types of violations. So if noncompliant cable is installed into a structure, a building, in one of these jurisdictions that has adopted the NEC, enforcement may still be a very likely possibility. So what are the enforcement tools that are available to different jurisdictions? Well, again, this varies state to state, locality to locality, but looking across the board, there are about 4 general enforcement tools that we've seen. One is to stop the installation. And that would be, a locality could go, or a government or a enforcer, whatever the local law enforcement body could go in, could seek to stop the installation of a non-compliant cable product before it's complete. So they could go to court to get an injunction, or they could do that on their own, depending on the jurisdiction. And also, as I'm walking through these enforcement tools, I want to note that many jurisdictions may have only one of these enforcement tools available, but also others have several available. So, in other words, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record on this point, but it really is important to understand where you're doing the work, what particular tools are at or what particular tools enforcement could exercise in going after this non-compliant cable. So one is stop installation. That's sort of before installation is completed. Second is the repair option, and that would be if a building has already been, or a structure has already been finished, or the installation has been completed. There are some instances where a state or a county, whatever the body is that's doing the enforcement, can go in and order the installer, the contractor, whoever's on the hook for that construction, to repair that non-compliant cable. And obviously, as we know, in the case of many of these products, that could be quite an extensive and costly process. The next one here, there are criminal penalties in many of these jurisdictions, not in all, but in many. We're not talking about serious criminal penalties. Most are misdemeanors. So that would mean fines generally of $1,000 to $2,000, depending on what the nature of the violation is, but also may include some jail time. And so I say that not to scare you, but to say, those enforcement mechanisms are on the books. It is, of course, always up to a prosecutor or whoever is administering the law to decide when to go after and when to seek these types of penalties. But there are criminal penalties, including jail time of up to 6 months, authorized for violations of building codes in some of these jurisdictions. Of course, building codes that we would be concerned about here being those that have incorporated the NEC. And then finally here we have, and it sort of leads into our next topic, is the private right of action. So what that means is instead of a law enforcement body going after a contractor, an installer for the installation of non-compliant cable, some of these laws permit private citizens then to sue to go after the installers of the non-compliant cable to recover damages or recover other costs and penalties as a result of that of the installation of cable that does not comply with the law. Okay. So that covers the types of building code violations and the penalties that we have seen and that are available to prosecutors and law enforcement arms around the country. The next category that we're talking about is civil liability, potential civil liability for the installation of non-compliant cable into a building. One point of information here as we start to talk about civil liability, what that means for, I usually talk to lawyers, so they always know what I mean by this, but for those of you who are not lawyers, just try to conceptually understand what that means. In the case of a building code violation, again, it's the government that's going after someone for a violation. In the case of a civil liability, it's a lawsuit, so a private party suing another private party, in this case the contractor or the installer, for damages sustained as the result of non-compliant cable that wasn't installed. So, for instance, and maybe most relevant here, is if there were a fire that occurred that was as a result of or made worse by the installation of a non-compliant cable, there may be a cause of action, a viable cause of action for damages that could be filed by the property owner, the inhabitant, whoever was in that building at the time that this happened. And that would be a lawsuit. In many cases, it would be a lawsuit against the contractor or the installer, among other parties. But today we're just focusing on potential installer liability. Again, these claims we'll walk through here, as you can see on the slide, but they can come in different forms. This is also a matter of state law. So it depends on the state, what precisely has to be shown for certain causes of action, what damages are recoverable, et cetera. But these three that we're going to talk about today are pretty standard across the board in all states. So pretty comfortable talking about potential liability and what goes into the consideration of whether or not there's a cause of action that on which damages can be recovered. So we'll start here first with negligence. So a negligent cause of action that has four general what we call elements, or what a plaintiff would have to show in order to collect damages. And then we'll go into some of the issues that are most important to you all, I would think, for the purposes of this discussion about installers. One being that there is a duty, so we'll talk about that more in a minute. Two, that duty was breached. In other words, the contractor or the installer did something that breached the duty. And then third, that there was causation. In other words, that duty caused, and then finally damage. So some type of harm to result. In the case of a negligence cause of action, that has to be, those damages are limited or are restricted to any damage that's caused to something other than the cable itself. So in this case, we'd be talking about if there was a fire, for instance, it would be a house that burned down, it would be a building that was damaged, something like that. That would be the root of the damage that could potentially be recovered on a negligence action. But going in for the main issue for the non-compliant cable on a negligence cause of action is this establishment of a duty to install cable that complies with the NEC. So that would really be what we're looking at here in most cases. And that's an issue that is not across the board established in every case, but it's something that would be up to a judge or a jury to decide whether or not a contractor had a duty to install compliant cable into a structure where there's been damage caused as a result. Again, to go back to this point, knowledge is not necessarily required in order for a negligence cause of action to be successful. And in the next term I have on here, negligence per se, that's relevant here because that's a concept that establishes duty. So it establishes a potential negligence cause of action where there is a law on the books that addresses the issue. So in this case, this would be going back to the applicable building codes. So if there's a jurisdiction that has adopted the NEC into the building code and then some additional damage has resulted, as, for instance, in the event of a fire, that would be a potential ground for negligence per se. And we have seen that in some cases. Courts have held that for breaches of the applicable building codes. That being said, in cases of the negligence per se, a plaintiff would still have to prove damages and other issues. So it's not a completely foregone conclusion that violations of a building code will result in an action for negligence, but it is something to be aware of when going into and evaluating potential liability for these issues. So the next cause of action here on my slide is fraud. And fraud is a sort of a tricky issue, and it's tricky because it requires a heightened showing than a typical tort cause of action like negligence. So in the case of fraud, a plaintiff would have to show that a contractor or an installer made a false representation of fact to induce the claimant to act, and that the defendant knew the representation was false. So in the case of non-compliant cable, what are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about, in many situations, it may be if a contractor or an installer has actual knowledge that it installed non-compliant cable, but told a customer, whether it be a homeowner or another property owner, whoever the customer may be, that the cable complied with the NEC or with the building code. That could be enough to show fraud. But again, this is a completely different situation than we're talking about, for instance, in the case of negligence. So there's this requirement that there be a false statement. And so it's an easier call on a lot of these fraud causes of actions, whether or not there's a viable case. But that being said, even though since there's a heightened showing, so you have to show that the contractor or the installer knew that what he or she was saying was false, there are additional damages that are available for fraud actions, so that you'd be able to, or a plaintiff will be able to recover more money on fraud than on, let's say, a negligence cause of action in most jurisdictions. All right, finally here, we're getting to the breach of contract and breach of warranty claims that may result if a contractor installs non-compliant cable. And these are slightly different, but in many cases it depends on the agreement between the parties. So what do I mean by that? Well, there are two types of warranties, implied and express warranties, and obviously other terms of a contract. So if, for instance, in some cases, a contract between parties resulting in, the installation of this cable may be that the cable complies with the law. That's a very general term, but you could see there, if you're in a jurisdiction where you or someone as an installer or a contractor has said, I will install cable that complies with the law, and in that jurisdiction, the building code adopts the NEC, and the installer goes ahead and installs some cable that it does not, it's some of the non-compliant cable that we've been talking about today, that could potentially be a breach of that contract. And I raise that for you today just because it's sort of it's a long chain of connecting the dots, but that's how plaintiffs may come after certain installers for these types of damages. In addition, in the case of a warranty or an implied warranty, in many jurisdictions there are warranties that sort of attach to certain work that is done, and many of you may already know about this, but for instance, one is that every construction contract, in most jurisdictions, construction contracts include warranties that structures will meet building code requirements. So if you're in a jurisdiction where that happens, you install cable that doesn't comply with the NEC, which has been adopted, then there's a potential for breach of implied warranty in that case as well. Now, there may be disclaimer warranties in contracts between parties. There may be other terms in contracts between parties. So I raise this as, as a point for everyone to think about, but it's something that also in many cases may be contracted around or may be dealt with in the writing between the parties. So it's, again, just another pitch that you need to understand, the jurisdiction you're in, the requirements in that jurisdiction, and also what you're agreeing to when you enter into contracts with customers or other contractors. Finally, here on the breach of contract and warranty cable or issue, is the issue of damages. And so in this case, typically damages, in other words, what an installer would have to pay if it was found liable, is the cost to repair the problem. So in this case, it would be, if non-compliant cable was installed, the cost to go in there and tear it out and put in new cable in many cases, or the decrease in the property value as a result of that installation of non-compliant cable. So there are some options available there. And again, in many cases, it depends on the writing and the agreement between the parties. So you always want to know what's in those agreements and understand how they may affect these types of claims and these types of lawsuits down the road. One last thing I want to say on the civil liability front is that, so I've listed 3 examples of claims here that may be brought. There are others. Again, it depends on the jurisdiction. So many states and many localities have enacted laws, have enacted statutes that provide other types of causes of action for certain types of fraud, certain types of consumer protection, et cetera. So those should be evaluated. But across the board, these negligence frauds and warranty claims are viable in most jurisdictions. And then also, these may all be brought together in one one action against an installer. So it's not like you'll get one case that pleads negligence, but it could just be, as I'm sure many of you know, when you're dealing with civil liability, it could be a whole slew of causes of action. Some may stick, some may not, but really you need to be thinking about all of them and evaluating potential liability in the event of a lawsuit, because you or an installer may be on the hook to defend against those types of claims. So that is all we have for civil liability. And just to sort of go through the takeaways, again, as I've been saying throughout my presentation today, always be aware of state and local government laws and building code requirements, because as we've seen, that can affect both the enforcement by government and also civil liability in the case of negligence and in some cases breach of warranty. So it's really important you always know what's required of you in those places where you're working as an installer. And then secondly, echoing a theme that we've heard all day here, but being proactive to select compliant cable and doing the due diligence you need to do to reduce that exposure to liability and understanding what you need to do to comply with the law.